You're listening to Hanging, an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose, California.
Last time on Hanging.
KW! KW!
Hey, no! Come here, boy!
She gave him up like a dog. I took him. I raised him for a number of years. So whatever you've been told, and I already know that you've talked to the officers.
Right.
Okay? And you already know that the officers told you everything was on the up and up.
I have to ask, did you restrain him in such a way that he might have passed out?
I think it's completely ridiculous. Okay, completely.
You most certainly haven't done your homework very well because you're trying to dig up dirt on somebody where it doesn't exist.
You're asking me to believe you, not believe things other people have said in these court papers. How do I know who to believe? Welcome back to Hanging, the mysterious case of the boy in the barn. I'm Julia Prodis Sulek from the Mercury News.
Chapter 5.
I didn't expect to find Priscilla Merrick after all these years. Her name had been buried deep in Joshua Klaver's custody file from the 1980s, when Josh's unmarried parents battled for years over the boy in family court. Back then, Merrick was a social worker for the County Child Protective Services Agency in San Jose, California. 30 years later, I was amazed to discover she lived just a couple blocks from my house. So here I am, knocking on the door of this charming old bungalow, and there she is, swinging it open. This tiny, white-haired woman, 84 years old, smiling sweetly. I was just starting to ask if, maybe, by chance, she remembered the case of Joshua Klaver, the son of the sheriff's deputy in San Martin, when she interrupted. "You mean that who killed his son?" Whoa, okay, I wasn't expecting that. The next thing I knew, the retired social worker was inviting me into the living room to take a seat in her high-back chair. Why in the world would she blurt something out like that? What did she remember about this case of the 10-year-old boy found hanging in the family barn? It must have been one of, hundreds or even thousands of cases over her career. Turns out, she remembers a lot. She admits she doesn't know whether KW killed his son, despite her bold statement, but she has her suspicions.
I thought he was just a little kid who was afraid of his father. He was, 10 years of age? Mm-hmm. How many 10-year-old kids want to hang themselves? They're always teenagers who want to kill themselves, who want to die, who want to cut their wrists and so on. I don't know. 10-year-olds are not even they're not going through puberty. The kid was scared. He was scared. He did not kill himself. He didn't kill himself. I don't believe he killed himself.
For months, I'd been looking into this tragic story. I found the former wives and girlfriends who loved, then loathed Josh's father, KW Klaver, the former sheriff's deputy with the bushy mustache. I found KW's former colleagues, whose investigation into Josh's death in 1989 left so many questions unasked that the case was reopened a year later, then again in 2014. And I had just interviewed KW in Oklahoma, where he retired 13 years ago. He was emphatic. He said he had nothing to do with Josh's death. His son had hung himself, he told me, because Josh wanted to live with him, not his mother. But Josh's mother says the exact opposite. She insists Josh wanted to live with her, and he told her so the night before he died. I needed to find someone whose only job was to look out for Joshua. That was Priscilla Merrick.
I was a social worker, and I was called to the school to investigate abuse of the child.
It was 1985. Josh was 6, in the first grade at Rucker Elementary School in Gilroy. At that time, he was living with his father during the week and visiting his mother on weekends. Keep in mind, Merrick hadn't talked about this case in nearly 30 years, so it's remarkable how clearly she remembers some of this stuff. And it lines up with the same scenario Josh's mother had shared with me. And no, the two hadn't talked in decades either.
He told the school that the father had beaten him. I wanted to see bruises, and he would not show me any bruises. He would not show the school any bruises. And what I thought was that he was afraid. He did not want to go with his father. His father was an officer, a police officer, or a sheriff's, whatever, I don't remember which one. And the father came to the school with additional police with him. And he presented as a very dominant, demanding person.
Merrick told me she remembers 3 deputies, including KW, forming a circle around Josh and questioning him. She called it a shocking breach of protocol. They intimidated the boy, she said, and it was obvious they were trying to do the same thing to her.
They began trying to intimidate me, which was stupid. And they were going to take him home. And I said, no, you're not going to take him. His 2 buddies interviewed the child in front of the father, asking if the father had ever hurt him. And of course, Joshua said, no, he didn't do anything. It was like, we're taking over. They said, we're taking over. And I said, no, you're not taking over. I don't know how to explain his behavior. He was very pompous and very arrogant and pushing and in trying to intimidate. And there was no reason to behave like that with me, not at all. I mean, I was a quiet, nice, gentle, at that point, social worker who tried to help families.
Merrick was so upset that she contacted the deputy's supervisor right then and there. After a trip to the station, Josh went home that day with his mom. That incident at the school compelled Josh's mother, Kathy Atkins, to seek full custody of Josh. It set the stage for the brutal tug-of-war that lasted more than 3 years. Merrick told me she took the stand during the 4-day custody trial in 1986. She testified about what happened at the school and about another time she met KW when she was sent to evaluate the Klaver home in San Martin. It was neat and clean, but she'll never forget the encounter, she said. KW stood on his stoop, hands on his hips, gun at his side, she said, and made her walk to his door through a pack of snarling dogs.
What kind of a person has a small, tiny, I was thin and small at that time, a social worker walked through a den of, who has 10, he must have had 10 dogs in that place. All of them wild, and I had to walk through that. He wanted to scare you. I'm not the kind of person who's going to let somebody be one up on me. I'm an Irish woman. Anybody who tries to be one up on an Irish woman is stupid.
KW would later tell me he doesn't remember the encounter and had far fewer dogs. When Josh died, Merrick said, she found out about it from her boss back then, the late Henry Collada.
He called me and he said, I don't want you to tell anybody, but the kid is dead. He knew before it was in the newspaper or before it was anything.
Collada was the head of the Family Court Division for Child Protective Services. There's an award named after him for outstanding contributions to the Santa Clara County family court system. But here's the thing. Merrick told me that she and Collada both suspected there was more to Josh's death than suicide. When Collada told her about Josh's death, he revealed a detail that few people except the coroner knew, that when Josh died, his knees were bruised and scraped.
It was Hank who told me that the child's knees or legs, I don't know exactly, were filled with, he had been dragged by his knees.
Okay, this nearly floored me. The director of Family Court Services was suspicious within days of Josh's death and wondering aloud about the boy's knees being bruised and maybe filled with gravel. The autopsy reported nothing about gravel, only that his knees had abrasions. How would Collada know that? And why would he leap to the conclusion that Josh had been dragged? Unfortunately, because of Hank Cullada's passing, I couldn't ask him to confirm Merrick's account. I had already tracked down the doctor who performed the autopsy on Josh, Dr. Parviz Paktaman, and he told me that while he noted the abrasions on Josh's knees, he didn't consider them signs of foul play. Was that the right assumption in this case? Clearly, the bruised knees, along with the menacing impression KW left at the school and with his dogs, alarmed both Merrick and Cullada. But were their suspicions anything more than a gut feeling, sizing up a man based on the kind of person they perceived him to be? And should they have done something about it? Well, Merrick confesses they didn't. Not for months.
What could we do? I mean, what could we do? We couldn't prove anything. There was any more than anybody could prove anything. And the people that investigated were his pals. If the courts say it's a suicide and, the people say it's a suicide and two stupid social workers, I mean, social workers were not in great, people didn't have great respect for social workers.
But the time did come when Merrick said both she and Cullada opened up about their suspicions. Essentially, somebody finally asked. It's not clear why it took so long, but more than a year after Josh died, in 1990, Santa Clara County's Child Death Review Team examined the case and asked the sheriff's office to take a closer look. The group of medical and law enforcement professionals reviews unexpected child deaths. Its mission? To determine whether abuse was involved or whether the child deaths could have been prevented. The death review team summoned Merrick and Cullada. Merrick said she told the group about Josh's fear of his father, about the intimidation at the school, and about Judge Stewart's findings that KW had abused the boy in the years before he died. Merrick said the panel listened, rapt, and questioned why KW hadn't been arrested for the abuse. It's the same question KW had asked me when I interviewed him at the livestock barn in Atoka, Oklahoma. If he had indeed abused Josh, done all these terrible things people say, why wasn't he ever arrested for it? I asked Merrick.
I don't know why he wasn't arrested. He was a police officer. The officers were not going to arrest him. He's one of them.
After she left the meeting that day, she said she never heard another word from the Child Death Review Team about the case, and she hasn't talked about it since.
I had a reputation for being very bold with my speaking, and so I don't know whether they believed me or whether they thought I was nuts or whatever. I don't know what they thought.
Whatever they believed isn't clear today. The file from that Child Death Review Team meeting, like the rope from which Josh hung, is missing. I reached out to Dr. Michelle Jordan, Santa Clara County's chief medical examiner. She's also the chairwoman of the current Child Death Review Team. She's not easy to get a hold of.
Hi, Julia. It's Dr. Jordan.
Hi, Dr. Jordan. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I asked her about the Child Death Review file from 1990, and she said she couldn't find it. She went deep into the archives, but found no minutes, no notes, no conclusions. That whole era of files, she said, had been lost, wiped out, or purged. Do you know, just based on word of mouth and institutional memory, what the conclusion was of the death review team back then?
In 1990?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I didn't because there was no record. There was no written record.
Dr. Jordan wasn't around in the years surrounding Josh's 1989 death, but when she got a call from the sheriff's department in 2014 asking her to re-examine the case from the coroner's point of view, she jumped in. She's the one who went to the old Klaver barn that summer morning 3 years ago. She's the one who carried the old autopsy report and a tape measure down the gravel driveway to the barn to try to reenact the hanging.
I'm looking at a case 25 years later. I just thought it was really important and very thorough to go back to the scene and look at the scene for myself and determine whether Joshua could have been capable. And that's what I did in this case.
The questions Dr. Jordan set out to answer were, frankly, ones that she could definitively answer. Like, was it possible for Josh to hang himself? Was he tall enough? Was the chair high enough? Was the meat rail he was found hanging from strong enough? Other than that, there were many questions she had no way of answering. The files she carried from earlier investigations led her to KW's slaughter room on the left side of the barn. She spotted the bright orange metal meat rails inside. They were still bolted to a wooden beam, just like they were a quarter-century earlier when the Klavers lived here. So, what's a meat rail? Let me explain. Think of a steel railroad track that runs in a U-shape across the top of the butcher room. KW would hang butchered animals from hooks and slide the carcasses along the rail. It's unclear whether there were any hooks on the rail the night Josh died. Dr. Jordan didn't mention any. She was focused on whether Josh could reach over the railing to throw or tie a rope. Now, about that rope, there were some key items that Dr. Jordan did not have. As we revealed in previous chapters, the rope inexplicably never made its way to the autopsy. And in Chapter 4, KW told me he thinks the sheriff's department destroyed it because the case was closed. Its fate has only deepened the mystery. Jordan told me the original investigative reports did describe the rope as a woven 8-foot-long lead rope, but they failed to say how thick it was, a key detail needed to match the half-inch ligature marks on Josh's neck. So that was one thing you wanted to see with the lead rope, that if the width would match the ligature marks.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. And that's what, that was one of my questions when I reinvestigated.
The old reports listed the distance from the floor to the meat rail, 89 inches. That's 30 inches taller than Josh, about 7.5 feet from the ground. And the reports mentioned a chair under the meat rail, but it wasn't clear if it was upright or had been knocked over or had been brought to the barn from somewhere else. Photos of the rope and the chair would have helped clear up a lot of questions, but none were in the file. Now, you said you had autopsy photos, but you did not have photos of the rope.
Correct.
Were there photos of the chair?
No, not that I recall.
What were some of the questions that you had that weren't clear from the information you had?
Exactly what the rope looked like. And that's when the sheriff's office recontacted Bobby.
That would be Bobby Klaver, KW's wife at the time, who came home that night to find KW inside the house before the two of them found Josh hanging in the barn. In a phone call 25 years later, Bobby was relying on her memory from that chaotic night to help the coroner fill in the gaps of the missing evidence.
And she helped us with what the rope looked like. So we were able to get a picture of what the rope would have looked like back then, even though we didn't have the actual rope.
Bobby described a standard horse's lead rope with a clamp on the end. If you don't know what a lead rope is, it essentially looks like an extra thick dog leash. The clamp hooks onto a horse's halter. Dr. Jordan told me she went online to do her own research and figured the half-inch marks on Josh's neck could, quote, well have been caused by a lead rope. But as she headed back to the barn, there were a number of questions she couldn't answer. Had there been a noose or a knot? Was Josh fully or partially suspended? Was he facing back or front? She didn't know for sure, because none of that was entered in the original report compiled by KW's fellow deputies. It's 25 years later, she told me. I'm doing the best I can do. Joshua Klaver was big for a 10-year-old. In the autopsy report, he measured 4 feet 11 inches tall and 115 pounds. Dr. Jordan is 5 inches taller and 3 pounds heavier. She decided it was a small enough disparity to use her own frame to stand in for the 10-year-old boy. So, on a summer morning in 2014, she went to the old Klaver barn to perform the reenactment. She borrowed a rope and a kitchen chair from the new owners. In the barn, Dr. Jordan pulled out her tape measure and jotted down measurements. Then she positioned the chair under the meat rail and climbed up. First question: was Josh tall enough to get the rope over the rail? Standing on the chair and subtracting her extra 5 inches of height, Dr. Jordan determined, yes, he was tall enough. Next question: was the meat rail strong enough for Josh to hang from it? Dr. Jordan reached for the orange rail and grabbed it with both hands. Then, with her full body weight, she dangled. It was clear to her that, yes, the rail easily supported her weight, so it could have supported Josh's, too.
It was very clear to me that Joshua could indeed hanged himself in that barn that particular night.
I was still curious about the rope. Wasn't it critical to determine if Josh had or could have tied a knot on top of the rail? No, Dr. Jordan told me, that wasn't critical, because Josh could simply have draped the rope over the rail instead. But I also wondered, since the meat rail was pretty low, wasn't it important to know if the rope had too much slack for someone to hang? Again, her answer was no. A person could wrap a rope around his neck a few times and press against it. When you block blood vessels in your neck, she told me, you lose consciousness in 10 to 20 seconds. Dr. Jordan's conclusion would carry significant weight with investigators in the sheriff's and district attorney's offices. They were still conducting their own look into whether Josh's death was something other than suicide, and had yet to reach a decision. As retired Deputy District Attorney Dale Sanderson had told me, coroner's reports are not the end-all, and they never have been. Sanderson was the guy who was watering his yard in the Almaden Valley when I found him. He had reviewed the case decades ago, maybe as far back as 1990, and he told me that just because you find a child hanging, how do you know the child committed suicide or was hung by someone else? How, he asked me, is the coroner going to know that? So I asked Dr. Jordan. When I asked you before, one of the things you said when I said, well, if someone had put him in a chokehold, and then strung him up to make it look like a suicide, if that's inconsistent, you said anything's possible, that's not inconsistent, but that you would need a confession for that.
Exactly. That would be correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's...
But if you're talking about, even in a chokehold, you're talking about someone who's 10 years old. And if you would think there would be more defensive injuries. I mean, is it possible that there's none? Of course, that's possible. But what we look for is any signs of struggle or any type of internal injuries. And that was not found in this particular case. There was nothing that was found at autopsy to suggest that there was foul play.
Now, there were mention of abrasions on the knees.
Yes.
And did you dismiss that as a typical 10-year-old thing, or did you think, gee, I wonder if that had something to do with foul play?
Well, as you know, 10-year-olds can commonly get abrasions and bruises on their knees, so that's part of the differential, but that wouldn't be a red flag to automatically consider that there's foul play, no.
What seemed so significant to Priscilla Merrick, and I have to admit, had me wondering too, did nothing to alarm the person responsible for deciding how Josh died. Are you confident that this is how he died, or is it that in the absence of other information or any confession?
Sure. All I can tell you is based on everything I did on this case, which includes reviewing the investigator's report, review of the autopsy report, review of all ancillary reports that I possibly could get my hands on, including a re-investigation performed personally by myself in a reenactment. I'm very confident with the cause and manner of death in this case.
There was something else that helped in her assessment. Josh was a troubled kid. As she put it, he was saddened. And because she could find no record of the 1990 meeting of the Child Death Review Team, she decided to reconvene the group a couple of weeks after her reenactment in 2014. The group keeps its deliberations confidential, but Jordan said they spent a full 3 hours discussing nothing but Josh's case. She wouldn't say whether anyone testified, but Priscilla Merrick said no one ever contacted her to reprise her testimony from 1990. No one asked Joe Fortino, one of the deputies who was at the barn the night of Josh's death, to talk about his memories either. When the meeting was over, the group of 22 professionals affirmed Dr. Jordan's conclusion, and it echoed the findings in 1989 of the original medical examiner. Cause of death? Hanging. Manner of death? Suicide. But this time, there was more. The board members finished their work, and they added something new to their conclusions, something that Josh's mother had tried to raise for decades. Along with suicide, Jordan wrote in her report there was a coexisting component of current or past child abuse. And so, for the first time in 25 years, abuse had become part of the official record of Josh's death. Her report would be sent to the sheriff and the district attorney, who were still reviewing the case. But I still had questions. With child abuse as a factor in Josh's death, what exactly did that mean? Okay, I know that you had said that Josh is in coming to the determination that child abuse was a factor. You explained to me that it meant that his psyche had been affected by this abuse. Is it fair to say that this child abuse could have driven him to suicide?
I can't comment on that. With me becoming involved in this case and then representing it at the Child Death Review Team is 25 years later. So, there might have been, had we have reversed the clock 25 years ago, we might have had more information available to us to assess that further.
The report did not mention KW, or anyone else's name for that matter. Remember, it's not the Death Review Team's job to lay blame, and Dr. Jordan refused to elaborate on the specific abuse. I pressed her, but she said she was forbidden by law to speak about it. A letter she sent to sheriff's investigators, explaining the panel's decision, gave me a clue. It listed 3 police reports from the 1980s, but the sheriff's office said California law prohibits them from releasing details on child abuse reports. They only release dates and addresses. So with some more reporting, I was able to piece things together. 2 of the calls were to Josh's school and involved KW. The other was from the time KW reported Kathy over Josh's puffy eye. That's when Kathy said the boy took a spill on a homemade bike ramp. This all happened before the 1986 custody trial in Judge James Stewart's courtroom. Remember, he called Kathy a nurturing mother and gave her full custody. So it's clear who the judge considered the abuser. I asked Dr. Jordan whether the Death Review Team had looked at Judge Stewart's ruling, where he listed 8 acts of abuse that Josh had suffered at the hands of his father. She said no. Neither she nor the Death Review Team had ever seen or heard of that report. And does it strike you as odd that you didn't have that Judge Stewart finding for the Child Death Review Team? Would that have been helpful?
Well, this is the first time I'm hearing of it.
I would soon find out, though. Dr. Jordan wasn't the only one in Josh's story who didn't know about Judge Stewart's ruling. A different judge, who gave Josh back to KW about a year before he died, never saw it either. Judge Jeremy Fogel was the federal judge who froze the death penalty in California in 2006. But back in 1987, he was in his first year in Santa Clara County Family Court. The custody case of Joshua Klaver showed up on his docket for an emergency hearing. Josh was 9 and was in a psychiatric unit because his behavior was out of control. He had pulled a butcher knife on his mother. Ever since Judge Stewart found that Josh's father had abused the boy, Josh had been living with his mother, Kathy, and stepfather, Dennis. Now, KW wanted custody back. I contacted Judge Fogel in Washington, D.C., where he's the director of a research center for the federal court system. He told me he remembered the case for all the obvious reasons. It was so contentious. KW was a sheriff's deputy, and Josh had died.
That's something that you don't forget. And, it was very hard not to wonder whether if I had done something different in the custody order, it would have made a difference.
What Judge Fogel didn't remember, however, was any mention of the abuse. Judge Stewart had laid it out in gut-wrenching detail only a year and a half earlier. I read him Judge Stewart's findings, that KW had whipped Josh with a belt, kicked him with his boots, struck him across his face, and hit Joshua on all parts of his body. Judge Fogel was shocked. He had no idea that Josh had been abused. So he ordered some documents from the file all these years later to see if he had somehow overlooked it. I called him a few weeks after our first conversation for a recorded interview. What was your reaction? You requested those documents and you read Judge Stewart's findings of fact about the 8 acts of abuse by KW against Josh. What was your reaction when you read that?
Oh, I was just horrified. My immediate reaction, which I've shared with you, is that I thought somehow I had missed something, that, I had not read something that was in the papers that were presented, and I had been careless. And to think that a child had died after that, whether, regardless of what the cause was, that would have been just a horrifying thing to realize. And what I learned from looking at the court records is that I simply had not been presented with that information. But nonetheless, so it made me feel a little bit less horrified, but it still made me feel badly that somehow this child had not been served well because of the disconnect between the proceedings.
You said that had you known those things, you might have done something different.
I think had those findings been presented, that I would have been much more reluctant to order a joint custody situation in quite the way that I did. It was clear to me that Joshua was really in need of help. My goal was to give him as much resource as I could within the constraints of the family law system, and to hold the parents accountable, to make both parents responsible. If I had the view, after looking at this additional evidence, that one of the parents was abusive, I can't see making quite the same order, because you don't want to keep putting a child in the way of continuing abuse.
The judge's words struck me as a pretty profound acknowledgement that mistakes were made and maybe Josh's future could have been different. Here was a judge whose decisions over his 30 years on the bench have had a significant social impact. He's halted executions on death row. But Judge Fogel told me the decision he made in Joshua's case remains among his toughest.
You get a case like this, and you're seeing the results of many months and years of relationship and interaction between people and between them and their friends and community and so forth. And you're presented in a couple of hours, or sometimes even less than that, with the responsibility of trying to figure out what's going on and what the actual dynamics between these people are, and who you should believe and who you shouldn't believe. And sometimes you just don't know enough, and you can't know enough. Because you just don't have enough time, and because the people who are telling you these things are telling their story, they're telling it through their particular lens and for their particular reasons. And so, mistakes are going to get made. And the thing is that sometimes in cases like this, the mistakes can be very consequential.
He didn't want to speculate why Judge Stewart, who died in 2004, didn't refer the case to the district attorney in the first place. He also didn't know why the abuse findings weren't made clear to him during the emergency hearing. But at the end of that hearing, Judge Fogel restored partial custody to KW and implored both parents to work out their issues in order to help the child and get the treatment he needed. Without knowing about the abuse, he relied on child psychologists who had evaluated the troubled boy. Quote, "Both doctors state the child is close to being psychotic," Fogel wrote. "The main cause is the conflict between the parents." The message in that ruling would devastate Josh's mother for decades, and soon come back to haunt her one last time. Next time on Hanging.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Atkins, I am writing this letter to advise you of my review of the case involving the death of Joshua Sean Klaver on January 30th, 1989.
Yeah, I had conflict with him. I had conflict with him kicking Josh, slapping him.
There's no question in my mind that the abuse played a part in whatever was happening in Joshua, that abuse was so damaging to his spirit and his little soul.
No one was the perfect parent back then. No one is ever a perfect parent. And Josh paid the ultimate price for this.
Hanging is an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose. This podcast was hosted and reported by Julia Prodis Sulek. That's me. It was produced by my editor, Mike Frankel, and our sound engineer, Paul Baca. Videos and photography by Lipo Ching. Additional video production by Tor Haugen and Sarah Dussault. Our website is designed by Pi, and Mike Mayer designed the series for the newspaper. Bert Robinson is our managing editor, and Neil Chase is our executive editor. To make sure you hear every chapter, subscribe to Hanging wherever you get your podcasts. To see photos, videos, and documents, and to read the series and comment on this podcast, go to www.mercurynews.com/hanging. That's Mercury, like the planet, news.com/hanging. Thanks for listening.